now. Okay, good. I think everybody is assigned the roles they are supposed to have. I'm very happy to see you and welcome you all to this CNDS webinar. My name is Steffi Burchardt. I'm a professor at Uppsala University and the director of CNDS. And CNDS is the Center of Natural Hazards and Disaster Science and is a Swedish national platform for research on the interaction between natural hazards and society. And we do interdisciplinary research in the fields of social science, natural science, and engineering science. So we have usually a great mix of people, and we're especially interested in the interaction between natural events and society, and what turns a natural event into a disaster. And today we have invited some very special guests from Spain, the UK, and Sweden, who will all present some of their experiences and research on the topic of coping with disasters, the short and long-term psychological impact of natural hazards. And we will today touch upon volcanic eruptions that happened some decades ago, one that happened just a few years ago, and also the 2004 tsunami in Asia. So a great mix of natural hazards, but then also long-term and short-term effects. And we have 3 talks to start with. Each of them will be about 20 minutes, and we will have some time for questions. And then it will be great to bring the speakers together to reflect a little bit on and discuss as well their impressions from the other speakers, and also it's time for the audience to ask questions through the chat. And we have Eva Livma with us, who's the behind the scenes controller on this webinar. So she will also watch the chat in the meantime. And yeah, this webinar is already recorded, as you see. So we will then post this also on the CNDS YouTube channel. So to start, we invite Dr. Adelina Geyer from the Institute of Earth Sciences, Jaume Almera in Barcelona, to present her reflections on strengthening background knowledge and improve risk perception and resilience in volcanic areas.
Thank you, Steffi. You need to allow me to share my screen.
Okay.
Let's see.
There you go.
Okay, so let's see if this works. So now you're seeing the whole presentation,
Yes.
and now the PowerPoint, hopefully?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much, Steffi, for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here today and to present you a little bit the work we are doing at the Geosciences Barcelona. That, by the way, we changed name, our institute, in the meantime. So this is the logo here. And I'm part of the Applied Volcanology team in Barcelona, and we work together with the University of Barcelona in 2 main research projects or educational projects, outreach projects. Is a bit of everything. That the main objective is what you see on screen, which is strengthening the background knowledge to improve perception and resilience in volcanic areas. And we focus on Spain. And the fact is that in our country, we face a lot of people living in volcanic areas, but with 2 different realities, the one on the left and the one on the right. And let's see what they are. Okay, so the one on the left is an image of the La Palma eruption in 2021, which I will explain later. It had a great impact on the society. It's a tiny island. Well, the tiny islands are a moderate island in the Canary Islands. I will show you a map later. And the situation on the right side is an example of the several volcanic areas we have in Spain with no activity in the Holocene or hardly in the Holocene, but that they cannot consider to be extinct. So they are potentially active, okay? And we are working in both areas, but following different approaches, okay? So what is the situation in the Canary Islands in general and in La Palma in particular? The Canary Islands had two recent eruptions, one in 2011 in El Hierro. It was a submarine eruption with some impact on the society, but not as much as La Palma, okay? And then we have the 2021 eruption in La Palma, which destroyed a lot of houses, has a huge economic impact, and you will see later is the whole community is like strongly traumatized by it. So in total in Canary Islands we have 14 historic eruptions, 7. This is a map. Let me move your faces down. So this is a map of the Canary Islands. We had historical eruptions in La Palma, which is the island here, in 4 in Tenerife, 2 in Lanzarote, and 1 in El Hierro. Okay. So, which is the reality in La Palma? The community was not prepared at all for a volcanic eruption, even if we have seen just that there are 14 historical eruptions in the Canary Islands, okay? And even some of the people in the island had experienced 3 eruptions, one in 1949, one in 1971, okay? Talking to the community, to different people in the community, especially to the elderly, they recognize that because the previous 2 eruptions, the 1949 and the 1971 eruptions, were quite festive, that means that no damage was hardly done and no fatalities were declared, they kind of expected a new eruption as a festivity, as a party, as something special to experience, okay? The thing is that in this case, in the 2021, the situation was completely different because the eruption took place in a the highly inhabited area and with a lot of economic activity, okay? And it was a disaster for the society. So thankfully, and thanks to the 2011 eruption of El Hierro, there was some emergency planning and some crisis management, and it's still improving thanks to this eruption. So they are somehow prepared, at least from the logistical and from the decision-making point of view. As I said, the community was highly affected and is highly traumatized, especially the kids. The kids, they spend 2-3 years still crying when the eruption is mentioned, and they even didn't visit the volcanic cone until a few months ago, okay? So it's a strongly affected community from the psychological and economic point of view. What we have noticed, and what was curious to us, at least to the research team, is that there is a strong lack of educational material and of training programs to the whole community, okay? Even if they are aware that they are in a volcanic island, even if they experience volcanic activity. So this is one reality. Which is the other reality in Spain? The other reality in Spain is, for example, the Catalan volcanic zone. The Catalan volcanic zone is a monogenetic field that covers over 600 square kilometers. And the last eruption was 11,000 years ago in the Groscat volcano, which is similar to this one. This is Monsacopa. I selected this picture because you can see that the city is constructed around the volcanoes. This is Monsacopa, this is La Garrinada. We have new dating, and this is supposed to be about 8,000 years old, okay? So the community has never experienced an eruption in the territory, neither an unrest. There is hardly any emergency planning or crisis management planning, and if there is any, the community doesn't know about it. But indifferent to La Palma, the community is highly integrated from the cultural, the artistic, the socioeconomic point of view with the volcanic landscape, okay? They have a museum exclusively dedicated to volcanism, only for that, and the perception is low, but it has increased after La Palma eruption, okay? So these are our 2 realities. And what are we doing to strengthen the background knowledge and the perception in these volcanic areas where a future eruption cannot be disregarded and can happen any day tomorrow. So first, in La Palma, what are we doing? In La Palma, the target is the younger audience. It's the kids. There is no educational material. There is only one book from 1970 about the volcanism in the Canary Islands, which is completely outdated. So we are working on constructing, on creating educational material for the younger kids, for the younger part of the society, okay? How we did this, we worked with the teachers in La Palma, those especially affected by the eruption in 2021, those handling the traumatized kids. And we designed together with them the content, according to their needs, the characters of the books, and how to express the different concepts so they are more open to them and not traumatized or that they don't remember the trauma, okay? And for that, we published this book some years ago. This is a kid's book about the Volkies. I'm going to show you the characters. And what we did is that these characters that are quite friendly, inclusive, gender neutral, they travel to La Palma to know what happened in the eruption, how the people lived the eruption, and how they can be prepared in the future, okay? These are the characters. They are all volcanic materials, the Volkies. We define them as a secret club of volcano lovers that they travel around the world explaining volcanology. And these are the characters that we designed together with the teachers so that people can feel them as something local, they can feel identified with in terms of culture, for example. And so there are three animals, a pillow lava, which is very typical from La Palma, and a piece of basaltic column with some petroglyph, which is something very typical in La Palma from the Asian inhabitants. So the idea is that our former characters, these volcanic rocks, they visit La Palma. You can see here the characters. And the idea is that they explain how everyone lives in La Palma, the culture and everything, these ones, and these ones explain the volcanology. What we cover in this book goes from what happened during the eruption. You can see even some detailed things about the magma chambers, about the impact, the hazard, and so on. But we cover also aspects of how to handle risk, of the cycle of risk, how to be prepared, what kind of actions need to be taken care of. And we complement this information of the book with a webpage. We are preparing together with the teachers a blog, which is what you see here, which is going to be in 3 languages, in English, in Spanish, and in Catalan, also to be used in the other volcanic zone, and handles several aspects such as volcano monitoring, what kind of hazard we have, how to measure the size of an eruption. And the teachers, because this extra content is more addressed to teachers, can be accessed through the book with a QR like this one. And it can be accessed in 3 languages, as I said, but can be also downloaded so they can use them in the classrooms and do projects and do activities and so on. Okay. So the next step, what we want to do in La Palma is we are going to present this book to the different schools there. We're going to give some talks and some workshops, and also talk with the different teachers of different ages, of different school years, to define activities that can help them to teach what is La Palma, what is the volcanic activity there, what to expect in the future, and what is more important, how to be prepared and how they can help if an eruption occurs in the next 15, 20 years. Also thinking what kind of careers or professional developments are the best ones, to handle a kind of a crisis like, I don't know, firemen or decision makers, emergency planners, and so on. So let's go to the other reality, a lot where no eruption has happened. And the goals, again, are analyzing, in this case, the risk perception, the background knowledge and the preparedness, increase this background knowledge, reduce the fear, and increase the coping capacity. And then we are going to use the results to prepare for training and educational programs that at the moment are completely non-existent. Okay. Okay, sorry, I got distracted by the chat. So which are the methods we are applying here, which cannot be applied in La Palma yet? Why I'm saying this. In La Palma, we try to do some questionnaires, we try to do some interviews, but the population is still too sensitive, too traumatized to address this topic. We expect to be able to do that in a few years and to apply some of the results we obtain in the other volcanic zone where everyone is happy with the volcanoes. In La Palma, to be able to analyze, to assess how far the impact was, how to prepare better the population. But at this moment, people is not prepared, is not available for that. Okay, so what we did in Olot is to prepare some written questionnaires that we have distributed among the community, and we have also done some interviews, asking them about several things, about how they feel about living in a volcanic area, how integrated this volcano is in their own identity, if they feel fear of living there or completely they feel nothing, they just are happy of living in a volcanic area, in an active volcanic area. If they think that the volcanic area is active, which is the possibility of having an eruption in the future, this kind of information. Okay, sorry. So this is, now we are analyzing these results. And for example, this is an example of did you think the inhabitants of La Garrocha, which is the area for Lot, are at volcanic risk? So you see that there is a good percentage of that people say we disagree, we're not a volcanic risk, but some people are stopping and some people say that they are, even if the risk is small. Okay. So what we are doing now with this information is we are preparing a documentary, a 20, 30 minutes documentary that should be distributed at schools and in open platforms to be used in exhibitions or in educational centers and so on. And this documentary has two parts. First, the results of the interviews we took in the first step, and also some informational capsules. So information regarding the type of activity that is in Olot, what is an active volcano, what is an extinct volcano, and so on. Especially that kind of information that we are detecting that is fully wrong among the community, or that there are some misunderstandings or some fake beliefs. Okay. The other thing we are doing is an exhibition, summarizing the whole information we are obtaining with the questionnaires and the interviews. We are preparing an exhibition. This exhibition has about 30, 40 panels. And the idea is that any educational center, like schools or schools for adults, can apply for it. It's a temporary exhibition. They can apply for it for 2, 3 weeks or even months. It's for free, and it contains information regarding volcanology, regarding what kind of volcanic activity can be found in the Garrocha volcanic field, what happened in the Garrocha volcanic field. Also information regarding the risk management, the type of risk the Garrocha is exposed to, how to analyze risk, and so on. Why we are doing this exhibition is that even if this area has a museum, as I said, a specialized museum volcanology, because a great part of the region is a rural region, not everyone is able to access the museum. So there are several schools far away from the main city, which is Olot, that can have no money or not resources to go to visit the museum and the area. So what we are doing is proposing them to send the exhibition for free to the school, so they have like a appendix of this museum at their own villages. Okay, so together with this exhibition, what we have done is two things. One is a video, a 360 degrees video of the volcanic area. So we recorded the whole volcanic area with a plane. And so they can use virtual reality glasses to see the volcanoes, because many people there, even if they are living in the area, in the volcanic area, They are not aware about the volcanoes because they cannot access them. They have no, either because they are handicapped or they have some kind of disability, or they have no the resources to access them. Okay. And the other thing we are preparing is educational activities, like so that the teachers that they normally go to the volcanoes in the field and they visit the volcanoes, they can do with the kids there to a little bit go further in the assessment of how they feel living in a volcanic area, if they have the background knowledge, if they feel some kind of fear or not after La Palma eruption, but these are more addressed to the teachers. Okay? The idea is that this exhibition, aside of being able to be requested for free to the museum or to our institute, it can be downloaded for free in exhibition panels, and we are preparing a digital book. So I was a bit too fast, Steffi, sorry. But the thing is, okay, we have more discussion time. So the final remarks is that in Spain, we have several volcanic areas. We face the problem that because some of the potentially active areas never had an historical eruption, the risk perception is really low. Even as in the case of Olot, they live together with the volcanoes, they exploit the volcanic brand a lot. The perception is really, really low. And they are not prepared at all. Not the decision makers, not the community. Which is something, if we think about the psychological point of view, of the human point of view, is logical because they never faced the problem. But in Canary Islands, where they face the problems, we have a similar situation. We have the risk management and the crisis management plans and protocols and communication protocols. Everything is ready, everything is working and has been proven to be useful in the past, thanks to, well, they were prepared with the El Hierro eruption and they were improved in La Palma eruption, but the preparedness of the community is really low, especially in those islands where no volcanic activity has happened in the past, in La Gomera or in Gran Canaria, even if no eruption can be, and any eruption in any of the islands, an eruption can happen in the future. Okay, so this is what we are doing. If you have more, you want to have more information, this is the webpage, and this is my email address. I think that's everything I wanted to share with you, Steffi.
Thank you so much, Adelina. We can maybe take some immediate questions, reactions for Adelina. If there are none, I can just react by, I'm surprised that there was no preparedness whatsoever on
In
La
La Palma,
Palma.
you mean?
Yeah.
I mean, La Palma, they were prepared from the governmental point of view and from the decision-making point of view, because they had the experience of El Hierro. But was really surprising for me is that people, and they recognized that in the interviews we did with the teachers, people was expecting an eruption. So they hoped to live an eruption. And this was something very surprising to me, because then they were surprised of the consequences of the eruption. And then I asked them why they think they expected to have an eruption. And everyone said, even the younger ones, said, yes, because my grandmother remembered the last eruption as a high festivity. It was very nice. It was like a party. Everyone was having lunch in front of the volcano. Everyone was taking pictures of the volcano. This was in 1971. And the older ones, the ones that have experienced the 1949 and the 71, they say the same. So we have this ironical situation where in a place, we always say that, for example, like in Olot, there is no perception because there was no eruption in the past 100 to 100 years. But in this case, we have the ironical situation that even having two eruptions in the last 100 years, the perception was very low because the eruptions didn't destroy anything.
I think there are lots of parallels with Iceland now.
Yeah, exactly. It's a lot of parallel. I think I was chatting with people from Iceland. It's this a very similar situation. So you need a very destructive eruption so people get conscious about it. If you have a very festive eruption, as I brought in the presentation, it's counterproductive. Okay, so people feel like it's going to be very nice and it's going to be beautiful, and of course they are from the scientific point of view, but in this case, the eruption was in the middle of a urban area. And it was not the worst case scenario, trust me. So the worst case scenario would have been in the other side of the island with the airport, with the big city. So this was a disaster, what is a medium moderate disaster, and the other could have been a completely disaster. But a lot of people has lost their houses and the jobs. They have lost everything. And they are still living in containers, in, these pre-prepared houses somewhere in some villages, and they will never return to their lives.
Yeah. I mean, from a scientific point of view, the eruption, just for those who are not familiar with the La Palma eruption, it was seen as a success because the monitoring work, the warning work, people were evacuated on the same day. The location of the eruption was located really well before. So like if you just see it from a distance, I would say it was a success case of early warning. Nobody was hurt in the eruption. I think one person died.
One person died
cleaning up.
Yeah, cleaning the ashes. Yeah.
Yes. So, but nobody died from the volcano directly. So in a way, like if you just see it from very far away, you could say it's a success story. But I think this is an interesting aspect, and maybe we will get back to this also a little bit with the next talk. That people still, even if we as scientists think that like we did everything right and also the decision makers do everything right, it's still very traumatizing.
It's very traumatizing for many reasons. One is because people, it's an island, and at the end the community is not so huge and everyone knows each other. And apparently some people evacuated on Saturday, which is the day before the eruption. And some people took their things and their pictures and so different stuff, and they left the houses the day before because someone has told them, oh, maybe this can be an eruption tomorrow, or maybe because they were scared. I don't know. The thing is that some of the people that left on Friday or Saturday morning, they turned back on Saturday afternoon, and others not. And people, they feel that what we see from a success from the scientific point of view, they see it as a disaster. So they don't understand why they weren't evacuated the day before, even if we have explained that this is not so easy to decide an evacuation, but they feel that they were like, that they should have been evacuated the day before or on Friday. Because they lost everything. They had no time to pack. They even left the pets and the cats and everything at home, all the family pictures, everything. So they had no time to pack. And maybe because I assume that, and this I have seen this in the Dana disaster. I don't know if people from the audience is familiarized with what happened in Valencia during the fall last year, is that we have these huge floodings. I assume some people saw it on the news. Over 200 people died there. And there was the emergency management was a disaster. But even if the emergency management had been a success, the background knowledge of how to react in this situation is non-existent. So even myself, I had no idea what to do if a flooding comes. Okay, I live in the middle of a city in a penthouse, so the probabilities of me getting flooded are very low. But those people living in Valencia, they are highly exposed to flooding, and they have no idea how to react. And this is the same situation in La Palma. The preparedness of the population, not of the governmental institutions, of the population was, I think, non-existent. They had no idea how to manage ash. They had no idea they had to wear masks and things like that. And this is what we are trying to solve carefully, because you have to do it step by step and addressing the population with care, so they are recipient of the information and they don't block you, no? And this is what we're trying to do with the book, and hopefully next year with other activities together with civil protection and the government, and say how to prepare in case of volcanic eruption, wear a mask, have an emergency kit prepared, and things like that.
Mhm.
Yeah. Because an eruption in La Palma can happen, maybe not tomorrow, but in the next few years. So probably most of the people we interview are going to experience another one. So yeah, it's a tricky situation.
Yes, thank you. And I think we will come back to this. I think this is a great segue to the next talk by Dr. Rhian Meara from the University of Swansea. I hope can you say something, Ryan?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Okay, yes. And now the very exciting thing will be, will it work to share your presentation?
I don't know. I'm going to try.
Yes, but I do have a backup in
Yes,
this
my
case.
computer's having a bit of a meltdown. I apologize,
Yes,
everybody.
I can introduce you in the meantime.
Hang on, let me just see if I can find. Oh, we might be okay. Hang on.
Yeah.
Let me try this.
Yes. So our next speaker is looking at an eruption which was really truly unanticipated. Well, we see some black screen.
Yeah, I also see black screen, so this is a bad situation.
Yes. Otherwise, I'm going to share your presentation and you have to let me know.
Yeah, it might be better for you to try. Hang on. Sorry, people. My
Oh, now
can you
something's
see it?
happening.
Can you see it? Oh, okay.
Yes.
I have an old computer at work and it's decided that today is the day that it's had enough. So we'll try this, and I apologize. But about 10 minutes before this started, I thought to myself, should I email you my presentation just in case there's a problem? And I decided, no, that was me being paranoid, but apparently it was not me being paranoid. So hang on, I'll do one more try and then I'll let you do it. I might just leave it like this. Can you guys see it like that? Is that okay for you all? Hang on.
Yes.
I'll move you down like that. Okay, I would normally open it up, but it's not happy, so I'll do it this way for you instead. And Rhian, come on. I promise I'm not normally this disorganized. The computer just does not like me. Okay, so I'll start. If anybody would like me to send you this afterwards, I'm happy to do so, just so you can see things a little bit more clearly. But I wanted to talk to you about an eruption. As you say, it follows on brilliantly from what we just heard about La Palma. An eruption on an island, this time in Iceland in the North Atlantic. And it's the eruption of the volcano Eldfell, which erupted in 1973. So you can see in this picture here, this is a view from the top of the cliffs to the north of the island, looking back across the town. And you can see, obviously, hopefully, where the eruption is happening. So that's my email address. If anybody wants to stay in touch after this, I'm very, very happy to do so. Oh, Rhian, come on. Actually, guys, I think I might ask you guys to share the screen if that's okay. I think that might be easier. So I'm going to stop sharing and let you share it. Sorry, everybody. Why, of today of all days, has my computer decided to do this?
Yes. So I have.
I'm so sorry.
No problem. I just need to
No, they can't
see where your PowerPoint ended up. Now I need to figure out how to share.
I apologize. I can't even see you guys anymore either.
Now I have problems sharing stuff. Okay. Can you see the presentation? Perfect. And then we're trying. You're seeing the wrong screen now, so share. There you go. I think you can see the correct screen now.
Thank you very much. I promise I'm not this disorganized normally. I'm going to blame my computer for all of this. So just to give you a bit of context about where we're talking about. So the picture on the right-hand side is Iceland. You can see the big, thick black line going through the middle. That represents where the Mid-Atlantic rift is on the land, where kind of the two tectonic plates are pulling apart. And where we're looking at in particular for this eruption is in that blue box at the bottom. In English, we call it the Westman Islands. In Icelandic, we call it Vestmannaeyjar. So it's the southernmost point of Iceland off the main coast. And you can see from those black lines, there's one labeled EVZ, which is the Eastern Volcanic Zone. And that is kind of a new part of the rift. It's moving down into kind of fresh land, propagating. And the Western Islands is right at the end of that tip. So it's really kind of geologically, it's a new set of islands. They're all volcanic. You might have heard of them from the 1963 eruption of Surtsey, which created one of the youngest islands on the planet. But particularly for us, we want to focus on the eruption from 1973, which is the eruption of Eldfell volcano. So if you want to change to the next slide, Steffi. Okay. So some of you might have heard of this eruption, but I'm going to assume that you haven't, just to make sure that we all have the same background information. So the eruption began about 1:50 a.m. really unexpectedly on the 23rd of January 1973. And I'm saying unexpectedly as a big deal, because back in 1973, we don't really have like monitoring or seismologists or things like that quite the way that we do now. So an eruption like this nowadays would have been known about, it would have been prepared for. But all we had to prepare people here were a couple of earthquakes. And actually in Iceland, earthquakes are not that unusual because of the tectonic setting. So there were no real advanced warnings that this was coming. And at 1:50, 2 o'clock in the morning, what happens is, as you can see in this picture, we have a fissure eruption. So it's not a volcano with explosions coming out the top. Instead, this is flat farming land, no evidence of volcano there. And then a big kind of crack opens up, measuring about 1,600 meters, so 1.6 kilometers. And that opens up, and you see in the picture here, you have what we would call fire fountains. So lava is kind of shooting up to heights of about 100 meters all the way along that fissure. You can see how close it is to the town. So there is a volcano on the right-hand side of the picture. That's Helgafell, which erupted about 5,900 years ago. And then where those fires are is about 100 meters from the nearest part of the town. So it was unexpected and really, really close to where we are. But because of the kind of bad weather on the day before, this is a fishing town, and the bad weather meant that all the fishing boats, instead of being out on the seas doing their fishing, they had actually come back into this harbour. So when the eruption started, there were about 70 boats available, and they were able to evacuate most of the 5,000 residents from the island over to the mainland. So within about 8 hours of this starting, between the boats and the airport on the island, everyone except about 100 to 150 people who stayed behind to help had all been evacuated safely to the mainland of Iceland. I'm going to change the slide, please. Brilliant. So as that activity carries on, the whole eruption lasts for just under 6 months. But over the first few days and weeks, what you see is that fissure keeps erupting, but at the either end, they start to kind of close down and build into one specific area of activity, which then builds up to create more of a cone, a volcano shape. But over those first few days, we see that narrowing down and it builds into one area. And it continues to be really effusive with lava flows, which we'll talk a little bit about in a minute. But we do also see quite a lot of explosive ash or tephra. It's not really big explosive eruptions like what we might see in somewhere like Mount St. Helens. It's very localized, but you still, as you can see from this picture here, you still end up within about a week or two. There's areas of the island that are buried by up to about 5 meters or more of volcanic ash and tephra. I quite like this picture because it shows obviously the depth of the ash and how far down the houses have gone, but also like the kinds of work that was going on to rescue things. I don't know if you can see in this picture, but behind there's a table and chairs, then maybe you can see a toilet. And I think there's another photo we've got with like baths and things like that. So you've got to bear in mind, the people who were working, who've stayed behind to help, they don't know how long this eruption is going to go on. They don't know how bad it's going to be, but they can see how close it is to the town, and they have to work together to rescue as much as possible. And anything that can be taken out and used in a different house is rescued, because in the 70s, there isn't that much stuff available. It costs to bring things in. So toilets are rescued, baths, things like that. There are some running jokes on the island, quite emotional jokes, but about how mostly it was men who stayed behind to rescue things. And they're very pragmatic and logical, and they rescue things like toilets and ovens and TVs and beds and things, and completely forget anything else that is, not needed to build a new house. So they do things like they forget family photos, you know, or children's toys that they might need, and all of the kind of the emotional things that make your home your home. And so there's a lot of jokey stories, and some of them are kind of very funny, and some of them are much more serious about what gets rescued and what doesn't get rescued. But overall, the area closest to the fissure is buried by up to about 5 meters, sometimes up to 7. And a lot of those houses are still buried to this day. And I'll talk a bit more about that afterwards on the coming slides. So you can change, please, Steph. Thank you. So if you've heard about this eruption before, it's quite likely that you've heard about it because Eldfell and the people who were on Heimaey during this time, they're kind of famous as this community who like fought a volcano and won. And in this picture, what you can see, they're a bunch of guys and they have these big water kind of fire hoses. And what they did in order to try and save as much as possible, particularly the harbour, because obviously this is an island, it's a fishing village, it's based around the economy is based around the sea. They tried to protect houses and businesses, but more to protect the harbour. They set up these really complex systems where they pumped cold seawater across the lava flows for days and days at a time. And the reason for that is, you know, lava is obviously molten rock, but as it cools down, it turns back into solid rock. And if you can cool it down faster with water, then that rock slows down. It doesn't move as fast. And then the more that it cools down, the more that the rock kind of penetrates back into the molten lava flow. It basically creates its own barricade. So you don't have to go around building barricades if you can create your own barricade. So this is one of the first times this was done. It has been done in other places since there as well. And it was incredibly successful. The town did still lose 400 homes and businesses overall from one specific area. And that's still incredibly complicated and emotional as part of this process. But the harbour was saved itself. And the general feeling was, you know, if we fail to save the harbour, if that closes up, then there is no town. Even if the rest of the town is fine, there's no town if we can't get in and out of the island and if we can't do our fishing here. So this became an absolute priority. Do you want to change the slide? So the thing I wanted to talk to you about was the project I've been working on, and it was called Magmatic Memories, Eldfell 1973. And I've published this last summer, so I'm happy to pass on the paper if anybody would like to read. But it was brought around by the fact that, you know, 2023 was the 50th anniversary of this eruption. And I went there on a day trip as part of a recce for an undergraduate field trip. And as I was walking around the island, it got me thinking, you know, like 50 years is quite a long time. Maybe not from a geological perspective, but from a societal perspective. So I wanted to understand, you know, how is this community, how do they commemorate or how do they remember the eruption? Are there any kind of celebrations? Is it seen as a positive thing? Is it seen as a negative thing? That kind of led on to questions about, well, you know, over 50 years, what are the lasting impacts? You know, we've just heard from Adelina about the modern impacts, the current impacts in a short term, but what are those long-term impacts? And the questions were kind of triggered by reading this paper by Hafsteinsson Árnason. They write a paper on the museum on the island, and the museum has been built in such a way, which I've got a photo of you later, where they've dug down through that ash and they've uncovered a house. And they've built a museum around the house. So you can go in and you can see, you know, the damage that was caused. You can see the things that were left behind. And they investigated this museum and how it was created. And they found that although it's been award-winning and it's incredibly successful and really engaging and immersive, a lot of the local people who had first-hand experience of the eruption couldn't go in. You know, it triggered PTSD-style symptoms from them. And that got me thinking, like, if a museum can cause PTSD symptoms in you, then that suggests that there's a long-term implication here for this eruption. So that's kind of where I went to. So we can do the next slide, please. So this started off as a small project to do while I was finishing up my mat leave, and now we're kind of 4 years in and lots of other things on the go as well. But in this part of the project, couple of different themes turned up about how the eruption was commemorated. So firstly, in this map, this is an aerial shot of the town as it is now. The white buildings and grey streets, those are all the present day buildings that you can see on the island. And then if you look at kind of the right-hand side, there's a wiggly blue line, and that represents where the old coast was, where the edge of the island was. So any of the brown material is brand new land that's been created in this eruption. So you can see how much more land there is. And then the kind of paler or shaded red buildings and grey there, those represent the streets and the buildings that were lost during the lava flow. So it's quite a big area of the island if you think about the size that it used to be. And what we found was, like, the eruption is definitely commemorated and remembered in different ways. But actually, a lot of the commemoration is less to do with the eruption itself, more to do with that area that was lost. So I've got some photos on the next 2 slides for you, but a lot of the commemoration was kind of I'll go a second. It was things like, how are they remembering the eruption itself versus how are they remembering the damage and the loss that was caused by the eruption? And the location of specific memorials is really important. So in that area where the red buildings are, almost all of the memorials are in that one little quadrant of the island, and they're all linked to places that used to be there. But then there was also an aspect of kind of experiencing commemoration. Every year, for example, at the start of July, end of June, there is a big festival on the island, Gåslokahátíð, and it's a celebration of the end of the eruption. And as part of that, there are talks, there are concerts, people go on walks together. A lot of folks who live on the mainland who never came back after the eruption, they would come back for that festival every year, and it's quite a big sort of community event. One of the other themes that we spent time thinking about was, we've found over 50 memorials so far, with more coming in as time goes on. But who are the target audience? This is a really touristy area now of Iceland. There's a really good boat that comes in and out several times a day. You've got the museum, you've got a lovely, a climbable volcano that you can walk up and back down again quickly. So it was interesting to look at who we thought the different memorials were for. Were they local people reminding themselves or commemorating for themselves? Or were they tourist things that have been put in with different languages for different people to understand? And who built and paid for those? So there was a lot of different aspects to the work. But if you flick over to the next slide, please, Steffi. So these are just a couple of examples. So on the left-hand side, there's a wooden signpost. There are 12 of these across the lava flows, and there's no other information about them, just the stand itself and the word. But those words have the names on them of all the streets that were lost under the lava flows. And so there are 12 of them to represent the different streets. They're put in the right location at the right angle to show where that street would have been. And next across, I kind of describe it almost as a gravestone, but it's a gravestone for a building that was lost. And you can see on it, there's a picture of the house, it's been put onto marble or granite. And then it says like the name of the house, when it was built, when it was lost, who lived there, and how far underneath the lava flows you now find it. And there's a lot of those dotted across the lava flows. And the third is a piece of artwork where a local artist has created a series of kind of ash pillars, and he's popped them around the island, and where they're located, they are the exact depth that the ash was at that point. And that information has been collected from scientific research or from kind of old archive photographs where you can compare against buildings and things like that. And then on the right is a picture from this Gåslokahátíð celebration. On the Sunday, there's lots of different activities, but on the Sunday morning, everyone will go to church and take part in mass. And then you walk together from the church through the graveyard up into the middle of the volcano to the cross, where you have the church choir singing and a bit of a band to support them. And then afterwards, everybody goes back down to the centre of town together and has soup and rolls and spends time together doing things. And the link at the bottom there, if you do ever go to Jaume and you want to go on an adventure and find all of these, it's an arc story map that I made for my paper, and it shows you where everything is on the island. So you're very welcome to use that if you ever visit. Next slide, please. So there was, it started off almost like a geoheritage project. What is being remembered? Where is it? What does it look like? How did it get there? And then as I was writing it up, it kind of occurred to me, well, all of this stuff is remembered and commemorated, but actually there's stuff that isn't remembered and isn't commemorated. And that's really what I wanted to focus on with you, is this uncommemorated aspect of the eruption. When we talk about the island, I've done it already in this talk, but when we talk about the eruption and the islanders, we talk about their strength, their resilience, their volcano defeaters, they're fearless. They did this and they smashed it, and they're still here to tell you about it afterwards. It's really, really positive. And everything is about being strong and coping and powering on. And isn't this amazing? And even a lot of the stories that you get told, even as a researcher asking the right questions, they're really funny or really brave stories. You know, the guys from the fish factory was saying about how they used to go fishing in the harbour, go swimming in the harbour right in front of the lava flows. And if you swim just close enough, it's nice and warm. And if you swim just too far away, it's North Atlantic freezing water. And they'd push each other back and forth to try and make each other cold, you know, during their lunch breaks. Or stories about, you know, there's volcanic gas coming out of the lava flows and filling the low ground. And one story was saying that, you know, I'm really, really tall. I'm over 6 foot and my friend is really short. He's only 5 foot. And it's always been a joke that I'm huge and he's tiny. But now I can use him like a canary. And if he passes out, then I know I need to leave because I'm taller than him and I've got a few more minutes, you know. So all the stories are really funny and really brave and really interesting. But like, that's just not the reality, right? So if you change to the next slide, please, Steph. You know, the reality is really different. If you think from the perspective of the people who were working on the island, who were those rescue workers, you know, we had just day-to-day life was terrifying. You know, a lot of them do compare it to living in a war zone because there's constant noise, there's constant volcanic eruption noises, there's constant ash falling or gas filling in the areas and you can't see or smell it. So until you start getting wobbly and nearly pass out, you don't know you're in danger. There's these volcanic bombs being thrown out of the eruption. There's lava coming down the hill. You know, so even if you go into a building to rescue things, that building might be full of gas. And they would say, you know, you'd open the door and try to walk in. And even though there was nothing there, it would feel like you hit a wall and you couldn't literally walk into a building. Other folks saying, we were in a building rescuing all our items. And then suddenly a volcanic bomb comes from the mountain, smashes through the window and sets fire to the carpets upstairs. And we have to abandon everything and just run out before we get caught in this fire. So there's like on the island, there's that constant danger. Then also there's that emotional danger. You know, you're constantly watching things damage and break and be lost forever. You're watching your own home disappear, or, you know, the school that your kids went to, or the park that you used to play at. You know, your whole community, your whole neighborhood is disappearing. And although you're maybe fighting really hard to achieve anything, you know, anything you can save is a bonus in this situation. But then when you get to go back onto the mainland for just a bit of rest, a lot of the men have said, well, we'd come to the mainland and people would have opinions about what we were doing and we were wasting everyone's time and wasting everyone's money. Just let it burn and then see what can be rescued afterwards. You know, but with that harbour, with the fishing industry and everything, they can't do that. So on the one hand, you're spending all your time in danger, trying your hardest to rescue anything that can be rescued. And then you come back to the mainland and you're given jip by all these people about wasting everyone's time and money. And, you know, you're everything you're doing is pointless. So that balance is really difficult as well. And on the next slide, you know, that's very important to look at it from the men's perspective or those who were working in the rescue work. But even for everyone who was kind of safe on the mainland, generally speaking, it was men who stayed behind. And generally speaking, it was women on the mainland. And back in the 70s in Iceland, it's perfectly natural to have at least 4 kids. You know, not for me, I don't want 4 kids. I'm happy with my 2. But like 4, 5, 6 children, big families is quite normal. And so all of a sudden you've gone from this really nice, small, compact, safe community to living in the capital city, maybe. Your partner is away, maybe working in really dangerous positions. You know, we don't have mobile phones, we don't have email, so it's hard to know how everything's going. You've probably been like separated or isolated from your whole network. You know, your mum, your grandma, your sisters, your aunties, your friends have all been separated across the whole country. So now you've got four children in a place you don't know with people who can't help you. The children have started talking, the children now are in their 50s, obviously, but they've started talking now in their 50s about how, you know, back in the day, they were really bullied. They were migrants, they were evacuees. And, you know, kids in school repeat what they hear at home, don't they? So they were coming into school and getting bullied, getting picked on, getting beaten up, being told to go back to where they come from and stop taking all of the resources from other people. You know, so even on the mainland, when you're really safe, there's that traumatic element of not knowing what's going on at home, not knowing if your stuff is going to be safe. You know, you can lose a house, that's one thing, but losing everything that you recognize as your own. And, you know, one lady I spoke to said, it took her a really, really long time to go home. And because she'd lost everything, her parents went back. And it wasn't until she visited them 10 years later, they lived much higher up on the island. So when she left their house and walked down, she suddenly had a moment where like she saw the view that she used to see from her own house. And it was just that she was higher up on the island, so she was above the lava flows. And it wasn't until that point, like 10 years on, that she realized maybe home wasn't the building and my stuff. Maybe home was the view and the space and the place that I come from and the people who are here. You know, and she said it was 1983 before she even felt like she could consider moving home. So if you flick on to the next one, please. And part of that, you know, there's this positive narrative that comes along with moving on from this eruption. And I say this with absolutely no judgment. It's just as an observer from the outside. But there's a positive narrative, you know, like this was bad, right? But it could have been worse. And we made it back and we were strong and we were okay and we survived and we succeeded. And that's so important. You do have to focus on the positives to move forward. But a huge amount of that positive narrative is really dependent on this concept that nobody died. Like a bit like what you were saying, Adelina, like one person died, and even Steffi said, but not because of the eruption. And it's almost like this huge thing we have to say, like, but not because of the eruption, right? Something may have happened. And the same is true here. There's this young man here on the screen, he's called Sigurgeirsson, or Ursi was his nickname. And Ursi died during the eruption. I'm careful how I word it, and I'll explain to you why. But Ursi was somebody who was part of the fishing fleet, and he stayed behind on the island to help with the rescue work. And before the eruption, he'd already had kind of a long-term injury from fishing that was managed through pain medication. And I'm being really careful how I word this. So, you know, during the eruption, he ran out of pain medication and he went looking for more in the pharmacy. And the pharmacy was in an area that was cordoned off. He shouldn't really have been there because they couldn't guarantee it was safe. So he goes to the pharmacy to look for more medicine. The pharmacy as a building has filled up with gas and he's unaware of that. And so he gets overcome by the gas and is killed by that. And he's not found until a few days later when they realize he's missing. And the reason I say I'm being really careful about what I say is because Ursi's death is for a long time really glossed over, because you can argue, well, he died by gas, not by volcano. So it's fine. That was nothing to do with us. That was the volcano, that was the gas. Speaking as a volcanologist, there is no gas without a volcano. So like I don't agree with that. But then, you know, there are other arguments about like, oh, well, you know, he's not technically an islander, so like no islanders died, which sounds really callous. But like, I think in this sort of situation, when you're looking for any way to stay strong and together, you look for anything you can. And then the other aspect is people say, well, he was a junkie and he was stealing drugs. Like he's not a perfect victim. He was doing something naughty and these things happen. But again, like, do you see how the way I worded it was there's a long-term injury that's being pain managed, and the other option was just to say he was doing something naughty. So, you know, if you can find ways to not acknowledge why he died or why it was relevant, then yeah, you can power on with this positive narrative. But as soon as you start to acknowledge that he was there to help and it was part of the system of the volcano, and, you know, despite complications, but despite not maybe being perfect as a person, you kind of have to acknowledge his death, and then it totally changes that narrative. Things were not okay. The worst case scenario did happen. And then if that happened, what are the other worst case things that also happened? And how do you deal with that? You know, so this positive narrative is really strongly kept to for at least 40 years. It's not until 2014, 2013 that an islander creates a documentary that's released as part of the festival, where people really come out and talk about what it was really like. So for 40 years, people were not ready to talk about this, you know, and even now, like, people will talk, but it's quite guarded. You know, it has to be with the right people in the right environment. It's not just going to be like, oh, hello, islanders, you're coming off the boat, you're visitors. I'm going to stand here on the dockside and tell you my trauma, you know. So it's quite interesting how a lot of it hinges on him and accepting what happened to him. So if you go on to the next slide, please, Stefan. Okay. So I mentioned to you about the museum, and this is a picture from when the museum was being built. So you can see there's kind of a trench in the picture and a white building, and that white building is one of the houses that was lost underneath the ashes. And in the build up to its open in 2014, they kind of dug out a lot of the landscape and kind of saw what were the buildings okay to be opened up or not. And this one happened to be. And I mentioned that the museum itself, has been studied. And one of the things that come out of that study was saying, a lot of people with first-hand experience, those are the older generation, although they don't disapprove of the museum, they think it's interesting and important, they themselves have not been able to visit. They've come to the front door and had panic attacks or gone in, and the museum itself is really dark and it's black and yellow and red and orange. And there's a thing where you can turn something and it creates eruption noises. Even just as a volcanologist, I didn't like it because I know that sound. And to me, that sound means put your hard hat on, maybe go away from the volcano because things are not okay right now. Come back later on. So you can see how that happens. But even in the building of the museum, what they did here, you can see they've pulled away the grass from the top, they've dug down, and all of a sudden, there's this fresh black ash, and it's being whipped up by the wind and carried around the island. And the grass is really important. One of the key things that happened when people moved back is they made a huge point of greening the island again. And they did it partly for agriculture. You can't have your sheep back on the island and horses until they've got something to eat. And then partly to kind of secure the landscape, because this is a very windy place in the North Atlantic. If you've got all this loose material flying around, well, then it's getting whipped up. So having the grass there keeps it down. But also from a control perspective, like if I re-greened the landscape, if I planted that grass, then that grass is now there because of me, and I'm in control of my landscape again. And if you lose that, then you lose that small amount of control that you got back over your landscape. So next slide, please. And then just one or two of the last slides for me is saying, we're 50 years on now, and from an earth sciences geologist perspective, a lot of the people I've said to, oh, I'm working on this project, I'm doing this, they've politely almost patted me on the head and gone, oh, well done, you found something interesting to look at, but why? Nobody cares about this. It was 50 years ago, right? But 50 years ago, geologically, yeah, we've had so many other eruptions since then. We're doing all these other things. But the people on this island still have bad reactions to other natural disasters. There was an earthquake in 2000, and one of my interviewees said that she was so terrified by the earthquake that she forgot she had children and left the park and ran home to be safe, leaving her children behind because she was so overwhelmed by it. And then, she was okay and they were okay, and she went back and found them and it was all fine. But, the level of internalized fear there is that you could forget something as important as your own children. When there are big storms, people get really rattled and really kind of worried that the storm sounds are maybe masking another eruption. And when Eyjafjallajökull erupted in 2010, that's this picture, the ash came directly south, if you remember that satellite image, and that went straight over the islands, and people were panicking, trying to clean up the ash. I can't let that ash settle, because if it settles, then it's happening to me all over again. So even now, 50 years on, it might not be trauma with a capital T, but there is still trauma being felt by the people on this island and how they react to their environment. So you swap to the next slide, please. Okay, and then this is kind of the last picture of the island for you, and then one other slide. It looks beautiful, right? As geoscientists, as people who are interested in hazards, look at this amazing place. It's got these 2 volcanoes. It's covered in lupins. It's a wonderful place to go walking. But this is a really contested landscape. I was there last week and I had a nice chat with somebody in the pub about this, and they were saying that there's conversations locally in the council about whether or not they should clear away the lava flows. They could bulldoze them away and reuse the land for something else, because this is a really nice part of town. It's really good land. It's quite valuable land. And generally speaking, the older people who remember the island before are really pro this. They think we should get rid of the lava flows. They're ugly. They represent the loss of our town. They represent all of our trauma. Clear it away and build something new. Whereas the younger generations, and I am being quite general, but the younger generations all feel like, look at it, it's beautiful. It's a habitat. There are birds, there are insects, there are animals living here. It's bringing in the tourism that gives us all our jobs in the summer. Why on earth would we clear it away? So 50 years on, what is essentially a pile of rocks is still this contested landscape of who should dominate it. Can we clear it away or not? So if you swap to the last slide for me, please. Yeah, so I'm giving you a very whistle-stop tour of this. But over the summer, I worked with a group called Time for Geography to create small, sort of short videos about the eruption and like the evacuation and the long-term implications. They're all free to watch, so you're very welcome to go and have a look at those slides if you ever want to. And then my last slide for you is the next one. Yeah, so this is the last thing I wanted to leave you with, right? Because I work with geologists all the time. I am a geologist by training, and we love chemistry and we love physics and we love poking rocks and doing things. But as I said, you know, the people I've worked with, even some of the geologists in Iceland, have kind of been like, oh, bless, yeah, this is a really interesting project for you, I guess, but like, who cares? And like, this picture is why we care, because this is Eldfell and Heimaey was the only place in Iceland where kind of in modern times a volcanic eruption had impacted on a town. But now this is happening again. And not just that it's happening again, it's happening in the same way. There's so many comparisons between the two situations, but also it's happening to some of the exact same people, because some of those people left Heimaey in 1973. They resettled in Grindavik because it is also a fishing town. It had everything they needed. And now they've been evacuated for a second time in their lives. You know, so it's literally happening the same to the same people in this instance. You know, so there's loads of lessons to be learned from the science, from the two different eruptions, but there's so much to be learned about, like 50 years on, this is how this community is still coping with what happened 50 years ago. This is what might happen to this community as well. And, you know, I think what, I'm just going to quote you, sorry, Adelina, because I wrote it down quickly while you were talking, but, you know, I think you said that something can be a scientific success while still being a social disaster. And I think that is exactly what is happening here in Grindavik at the moment. You know, scientifically, we're absolutely smashing it. We've built all these walls and we've protected the town and we've protected the power station. But what are we doing to protect the people and their connection to their land and where they come from? Yes, that's all I had to say. And thank you very much for coping with my technical complications.
Thank you so much. It was so interesting, and I think we will have a great discussion. But because we're a little bit behind time, just because of the technicalities, let's move on to our last speaker, and I will stop sharing my screen. And then we have some time for discussions, because this is becoming really interesting, looking at both the talks. But now we're moving on to Kalle Ekholm, who is working at Uppsala University, and he and his colleagues have studied the survivors of the Swedish survivors of the 2004 tsunami, and also looking at the long-term impact of those who survived. So, Kalle, you have the word.
Thank you very much. First of all, can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Wonderful. Let's see if I can change it as well. There we go. So thank you, Steffi and CNDS, for inviting me to this very interesting webinar. And after two talks about volcanoes, we take a slight detour to look at a tsunami instead. So the title of this presentation is Living as a Survivor, Social and Political Outcomes for Swedish Tsunami Survivors. And my idea that this presentation is sort of a description of some of the results we found in a larger project that was called Living as a Survivor, a study of the political, social, and economic integration of tsunami survivors. So I was a postdoc at Uppsala University. I stopped working on this project a few months ago, so it's been very nice to take some time and dive back into it again. And the PI, the principal investigator, was Lina M. Eriksson at Uppsala University as well. And then we were joined by Kåre Wernby, who is a professor at Stockholm University. And this is funded by the Swedish Research Council. And the aim was to study the individual effects of exposures to trauma caused by natural disasters in general, and maybe specifically by this tsunami, in three interconnected spheres. And we wanted to look at the political sphere. We are political scientists, so we have an interest in that. But we also wanted to look at the economic and social sphere. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the methodological decisions we made, but I can say that the data is composed of, in one part, the administrative registry data, basically covering the entire Swedish population. It's the data that the government collects in order to tax us and keep track of our schooling and such. And then we also sent out a survey to 10,000 individuals, 5,000 who were exposed to the tsunami, and then 5,000 in a control group. So just to briefly introduce the project. So basically, as we all know, as a consequence of climate change, natural disasters are on the rise. And I think it's important for us as a society and for us as academics to understand how people and communities are affected by these events in order for us to build effective systems to be able to handle these very traumatic and events in the future. I think we can look at past events to see how it has affected people and communities. And our general motivation is mainly twofold. Sweden was very affected. We had 16,000 people who were evacuated, around more than 500 who died. And it's I think it's important, for me at least, for their sake, to study how they actually fare in areas other than just the health sphere. And I think when it comes to the study of natural disasters and the individual outcomes of these is something that's very difficult to study. And I think this specific case can further our knowledge in a very in an incredible way that I'll come back to later. As I said, we had an ambition to go beyond looking at health outcomes. Other studies, very good studies, have looked at this specific group of people prior and studied their health. But we sort of argued that it's important to understand how they were affected politically, socially, and economically as well. Health is more than just being healthy, so to speak. You need to be able to live in a society and partake in it and have a good life. So we wanted to assess how they're doing today in a broader sense, so to speak. So I think there are people in this webinar who can explain the technical or seismological events of the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami, and I think you're all aware of it. It was the worst tsunami recorded in history, especially if you're looking at the death toll. Some estimates are looking at 250,000 deaths. And while we usually think of it as affecting Southeast Asia, as we can see on this map, the deaths can be seen in as far away as Eastern Africa. We saw this in Somalia, Kenya, and Tanzania as well. That is, but it's important to note that most of the casualties were seen in Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia, and it caused suffering for hundreds of thousands of people in Southeast Asia and beyond. But we're looking at a very specific group, and that is the Swedes who were exposed to this tsunami. So Southeast Asia, and especially Thailand, was a very popular tourist destination, still is to this day. And Sweden had the highest death rate per capita in Europe. Lots of Swedes went there, and we saw 534 deaths and around 16,000 exposed. And it's important to note as well, when looking at the Swedish case, is that this was a very political scandal as well. It is the most covered event in the media since the World War II, and that is for a reason. It resulted in a very critical report called the Crisis Commission that lasted 3 years, and a lot of political responsibility were placed on the government, the Social Democratic government. And this report found several structural weaknesses in the Swedish crisis response system. For example, when people were calling the embassy, for example, the first thing they heard was that they should call their insurance company, for example. And this is not something that they expected from their government. So this was a very political event. So when studying the individual effects of natural disasters, there are a few things to keep in mind. natural disasters are very impactful events for both community and individuals. We've seen in research prior to our project that it impacts areas such as health, but also political outcomes, the economy, and social capital. And one thing to keep in mind is that it affects people and places in many different ways. So this picture that I have, I kindly asked an AI overlord to create a picture of people reacting to a natural disaster. But even just by looking at this picture, we can see some sort of someone getting help by their community, some sort of individual trauma, but we can also see the immense societal disruption. And for us, when we try to sort of explain some sort of outcome, it's very difficult to separate empirically what is caused by, for example, the individual trauma and the societal disruption. So we argue throughout this project that when we study the individual effects of natural disasters, we have to study them and see them as compound events that has a lot of different effects on people and communities. I'll come back to this later with a specific event, because the problem is that theoretically these can have opposing trends. So we would expect that the individual trauma to affect a person's in one way, but then we would expect the societal disruption to affect it in a different way. And what's unique about our case is that we study tourists who are exposed to a natural disaster while on vacation. So we can isolate the individual trauma without looking at the societal disruption, because they came home to a fully functioning society and were not exposed to displacement and so forth. Yes. So just briefly on the case and the data. So as I said, we use administrative data, and that's because Sweden loves to keep track of its citizens, and that's wonderful sometimes for us as scientists. We have data on income for the entire population and so forth, but the empirical foundation of this project is what we refer to as the Tsunami Registry. Basically, when people were evacuated from mainly Southeast Asia and came back to Sweden, their passports were scanned. And the National Police Authority kept this, and our PI was able to get that. So we have been able to identify all 16,000 Swedes who were exposed to this tsunami. And by linking it together with these other natural registries, we are able to basically match those who were exposed to the tsunami with identical people prior to the tsunami, and then treat exposure to the tsunami as almost like an experimental manipulation, that we have identical people prior to the tsunami, and then the tsunami occurs, and then we can track how their life outcomes vary. So we basically match them based on income group, age, education level, gender, and region of residence prior to the tsunami. So that's one part of the project. And then we also use this sort of method to send out a survey to 5,000 people who were exposed to the tsunami and 5,000 people in an identical control group. And this allows us to study the effect of the tsunami by comparing the tsunami group with the control group in various different outcomes. So we've been looking at a lot of different outcomes, but I'm going to go through a few, and I think I'm going to start with political participation. So I don't think it comes as a surprise that we as political scientists believe that representation is important. Basically, if we want our democratic system to function in the way it should be, it's important that all groups have the same access to it. It would be very problematic, for example, if you were exposed to a trauma and that led to you not being able to participate politically. I think it's really important that those who have been subjected to something that's possibly traumatic have a say in the political system. So basically our question was, how does exposure to natural disaster affect political participation? And this is a great example of that we need to treat natural disasters as compound treatment, because we see a very split scientific field here, with some studies that find a positive effect, that being exposed to natural disaster actually increases your political participation, while some find a dampening effect. And theoretically, this makes sense. Theoretically, it can be argued that sort of through the theory of post-traumatic growth, that trauma can result in pro-social behaviors. So we see this in a lot of ways, that being exposed to something traumatic can actually lead you to sort of make positive changes in your life. If I lived through this, I should really, you know, take advantage of life as such. But it can also be, this positive effects can also be understood through retrospective votings. Natural disasters to a large degree are political events, and natural disasters can as such mobilize voters. Maybe you felt that the government failed you so much that it's important for you to sort of blame them. So in that way, they can have a positive effect. But we can also see theoretically that it could be a dampening effect. We have seen that trauma in some cases can result in poor health, that through that mechanism can demobilize citizens. And we can also see that a loss of resources can have a dampening effect on political participation. If you don't have a roof over your head, if you don't have time, you're not going to go to vote, right? So we argue that by studying people who were exposed to the natural disasters while on vacation, we can isolate the individual effect and not have to care about the community effect. And that's quite nice in order to sort of figure out the effect, the different mechanisms that are taking place while being exposed to natural disasters. So in sum, I was quite surprised. As I said, theoretically, we could expect both things, but we saw a positive effect, and a quite big positive effect. So in sum, we saw that exposure to the tsunami led to around a 2% increased likelihood of voting. So what was nice here is that, as I said, we were able to match. So we have estimates of an election prior to the tsunami. So we can see on these figures here that prior to the tsunami in the 1994 election, there was no difference between the groups. Then the tsunami struck, and all of a sudden, the tsunami group were 2% more likely to vote, 2 percentage points more likely to vote. And while that may not sound like a lot, in a system like Sweden, where you can see we have between 85 and 90% of the population who votes, a 2 percentage point increase in likelihood to vote is quite massive. And if we look at this further, we can see that the positive effect is strongest in those who were severely exposed. And we classify them as severely exposed in this study as someone who lost someone close to them. So we could, through these registries, find those who lost someone close to them. And we saw that those who lost someone, their likelihood, increased likelihood of voting was around 45%. So it was a quite massive increase in the likelihood to vote. So these results are consistent with two mechanisms, that is post-traumatic growth and accountability, basically, that they blame the government so much. So it's important for them to punish them in the coming elections. And I personally lean more towards the post-traumatic growth theory, because we find similar trends when it comes to, for example, income and education level. But this study sort of was very nice because it was surprising, and this was the first study that we did. It took us quite a lot of time and ethical approvals to gain access to this data. So when I first ran this model, I was expecting something along the lines with that trauma led to a decreased political participation. So it was very nice to see that they actually were mobilized to do this. I'm going to talk a bit more about the trust in the government and in these institutions. So basically, I think that continuing with the line of the democracy and that democracy is needed in order to solve these sort of political events that natural disasters are. I think it's important to ask ourselves how exposure to natural disasters affects trust, maybe generally, but also trust in the government and the institution's ability or capacity to handle these events. So we looked at politicians, media, authorities, and people in general. And these are results from our surveys. So basically, this graph here shows that those who were severely affected by the tsunami, those who lost someone or were injured, for example, have lower trust in the capacity of politicians and authorities to handle crises compared to the control group. And what's interesting about this is that this is a lasting effect. As I said, this took place almost 20 years ago. So to have this sort of lasting effects shows the importance of handling these events in a correct manner, because while we see that people become negative towards politicians, that's not an uncommon thing. But to see that the effects are so lasting over such a long period of time is surprising to me as a political scientist, and quite disheartening in a sense. So we see that those who were exposed to the tsunami, especially those who were severely exposed, still have lower trust in the ability of politicians and authorities to handle crisis. And something that I found quite interesting as well is that we asked them to evaluate how the authorities handled the tsunami and a series of different crises. And while it's not surprising that those who were affected by the tsunami are highly critical of the handling of the tsunami, what's also quite worrying is that they rate the handling of other natural disasters lower than the control group. So this leads us to at least an hypothesis that being negatively affected by one natural disasters affects your judgment of the handling of other natural disasters. And that's not the case with other crises. So for example, they are not more critical of the handling of COVID-19, for example, but they're more critical of the handling of other natural disasters. That being said, this could be caused by the fact that the government who were handling the other natural disasters that they were asked to sort of rate the handling of were disasters that occurred when the Social Democratic Party was in government, because that's one of the more striking effects we see. That the question we asked is basically which party did you vote for in the last election? And compared to the control group, they have a 5 percentage points lower probability of voting for the Social Democrats, still 20 years later. And that is very, very remarkable. As I said, we often see that people hold the political parties and politicians accountable, but to see that they hold them accountable for such a long time, for 20 years, we see this quite massive effect, really speaks to the fact that politicians, at least, should be prepared to handle natural disasters, because if they don't, people will blame them for a long time. So, as I said, blame or accountability at the balance is to be expected, but this level of long-term blame is very rare. Let me just see, how am I doing on time, Steffi?
Yeah, if you can wrap up in the next few minutes.
Next few minutes, okay. I'm gonna skip one of the outcomes then, because I think that you're gonna be more interested in this. So as I said, we wanted to look at other areas than health, because a lot of great science has been done on the health of this group, but we wanted to look at it as well. And we did it as social scientists through the lens of social support. Because thankfully, we find no group level differences in health. So basically, at the group level, those who were exposed to the tsunami are as healthy as the control group. And we wanted to look at, okay, where did those who were exposed to the tsunami get their support? And this is quite striking because from our survey, we find that they only got adequate support from their friends and families. On this scale, where 10 is the best support imaginable, they got an 8 or just above from their friends and family, but really subpar support from from authorities and civil society. And this has led to a quite nice thing, and that is that we used lens of social capital, and that is the concept used to define networks and relationships. Basically, since I'm quite short on time, they have a higher degree of bonding social capital. And that is, they have stronger close ties with their friends and families, and they have this 20 years later. And that's a really nice thing, in my opinion, because it essentially means that they were able to get the support from their friends and family. So that is very endearing. But there is a flip side to this story, and that is that not everyone has family and friends who are able to give them the support they need. And that is especially true in a case like this, where a lot of people lost people close to them. So it's a vulnerability in the system that this group had to rely on the support from their friends and family. So our next question was, well, what about those who did not get support from their loved ones? And that is sadly the only health effect we find, that those who were severely exposed to the tsunami and did not get support from their friends and family have a higher probability of suffering from bad health to this day. And I think it's quite worrying that this is the case in Sweden, one of the most developed welfare states in the world, that was unable to give support through the state to this very vulnerable group. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind for coming disasters, because this was not the last natural disaster we have to deal with as a society or as a world. So just wrapping up. So my conclusion is that, well, as a scientist, I want to say that the individual effects of natural disasters are very difficult to study and identify. These events should be studied as compound treatments, and they are context specific as well. We can't expect that one outcome in one natural disaster is the same in the other. Talking to government or about government and authorities, my assessment is that they failed in many areas in the handling of the crisis. This is evident in the lasting effects that are still seen today. But I think that it could be seen as a wake-up call as well. If I look at what's in place now in the government, I think we are more prepared now, maybe as a society, but also our authorities. And my main takeaway is that those who were exposed to the tsunami are an example of how strong people are, even when they're dealt with the worst hand possible. As I said, I moved into this project expecting negative outcomes, but I found mostly positive outcomes, and that's sort of very nice for me as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Kalle, and thank you to all the speakers. We will now have some time for reflection and discussions, and we already had 2 questions in the chat. And Sara, I will allow you to talk if you are prepared to talk. Otherwise, I can read your questions.
No, I can speak.
Okay.
Thank you for interesting presentations. So my question was, I had one for Kalle. I was wondering if it could be the case that tsunami survivors come from upper and middle class families who are maybe less likely to vote social democratically.
Yep. I think, thank you very much for the question. So we compare them to a control group that is socioeconomically exactly similar. So I don't think that's the case in this case. So basically, we match them to people who are socioeconomically exact to them prior to the tsunami, and then we see the change. So that is, I don't think that's the case here.
No.
So I really think that the story about the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami in Sweden is to a large extent a story of the failed government response. So it's no surprise that they still blame the social democratic government to this day, in my opinion, because it was sort of almost sadly defining of the crisis and how we remember it. So it's not so surprising that they still blame them to this day. But still, to see someone blame a political party almost 20 years later, usually when people blame someone, it fades over time, that when they change leadership, the blame maybe goes away, for example. So this is quite unique in the case that the blame is so lasting in that sense.
Sure, yeah. And then my question was for Rhian. I really liked the descriptions, and you kind of put a very nice, almost ethnographic flavor to your presentation. And I was also very curious to hear, or I was curious about where, or the importance of those shared narratives, those shared positive narratives, and if you saw any sort of political movements trying to uphold them, or if there were any, I mean, did they serve any particular group's interest, or was it merely because the communities as such needed this sort of positive narrative to just stay together as a community? Or what was your observations and your analysis around that?
Yeah, so I can't talk about anywhere else because I've only done my research here. So, wider answer I can't give you. But my feeling for this area, there's no kind of external influence. I don't think it's political. I think that, when you think about the community here, they're an island community that, they've had so many traumatic experiences for years and years before, losing fishermen to the sea. There's a lot of historical things that are linked to that island. So in themselves, they are just incredibly independent and resilient anyway. And one of the people was saying to me, like, you need to understand, Rhian, those people over there on the big land, they are Icelanders and we are islanders. And they thought I wouldn't understand. And I was like, oh, do you mean like how those people over there are English and we are Welsh people? So they laughed that I understood what they meant. But, they've got a really long history of not being able to depend on anyone but themselves anyway. And I think in this situation with the eruption, it's not to say people on the mainland didn't help. They did. And there were scientists who helped and people in the community. But everything was about getting home. And, they fought the lavas themselves. They evacuated themselves. They fought the lavas themselves. They came back and cleared the lavas themselves. They built their own houses again. So I think it's not so much that there's an external influence, but just as a unit of people, they always have been really tight-knit. They always have had each other's backs. And even then, it's not like we all sat down on Tuesday and decided, in order to make this work, this is what we're all going to tell each other. I think it's quite natural, but if you want to go home, you can't go home thinking and concentrating about the negatives. You have to go home thinking about the positives and how you're going to keep going. And then I think you almost just get into this habit of thinking that way, so if I'm coming home, I'm going to be positive. Oh, and you've come home and you're being positive. So we're kind of positiving each other. And then she's come home and she's being positive. And it just sort of like everyone clubs together by accident. And then over time, you just reach a stage where you've been so positive for so long, you almost don't know how to stop being positive. And that's why, at the 40th anniversary, when this documentary is released, it's quite scandalous in the community that this has been released because, this is the story, like this is what we all believe and this is what we all say. And to suddenly have like 10 people openly talking about how that's not necessarily the case, it really like starts this whole like I would say, as an outsider, I'm very much an outsider, but as an outsider looking in, you could almost say, like, there's the before eruption times and there's the after eruption times, and then there's the positive times and then the open times. I would say, like, ethnographically, like you say, that is 40 years is this point. And even at 50 years, I mentioned that, like, the people who were kids who are now 50, it literally took 50 years for those people to go, whew, okay, now I feel like I can talk to you about what it was like as a kid. And it was almost as if they felt, okay, well, it took our parents 40 years to talk about their experiences. Let's give them some time to process their feelings. Okay, now it's been 50 years and they've had 10 years to talk. Now it's our turn to talk. And it was really strange watching that kind of conversation blossom, and it made it into the national newspaper as a story looking back as well. So I think sometimes it just takes a really long time because you back each other up. And it's a positive thing, but sometimes it's too positive a thing and you can't get back out of it without causing yourself a problem.
Oh, yeah.
Makes sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Sarah, for your questions. We have Jeffrey. I allow you to talk. Do you want to ask your question yourself?
Sure. I just wanted to focus on, or try to have a more focused question. Kalle, I thought that was a very interesting presentation, and I would love to dig more into it. But based on some of the data that you were presenting, I found myself being a bit skeptical towards some of your conclusions, especially about the cause and effect, that you're seeing these correlations. But I would have been more hesitant to draw a causal effect there. And so the one thing that I thought of was, how much of the collective memory, the media narrative, like how we've talked about the crisis response in the past 20 years, how much has that framed people's perceptions of it, versus their memories of when it was there?
Yeah. No, I think that's true in a sense, because I don't know how familiar you are with the political crisis following the political aftermath, but it was a drawn out story over years, with the minister being let go, and I think those two are connected. I think they were treated very poorly during the traumatic experience by a government or authorities who weren't prepared to deal with the situation, basically. And then through the narrative and the collective memory, it became clear that those who should be blamed according to the narrative was the Social Democrats. So I think those two are interconnected, right? That would be my response.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jeffrey. Then we have a hand up from Azriel. I can allow you to talk.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, great. Oh, many points that come to mind. I will bring my part of the work in the picture, and there is a variable that has not been addressed, and it is corruption. It is believed that when we have natural catastrophes in Latin America, that's the best time to make dirty money, because it's not accountable money. So the budget is not transparent. So that's one point about corruption, as assumed to be in the South. But after surviving in Sweden for about 40 years, I have learned that there is corruption here in different subtle ways. But we won't go into that. Something that has to do with natural catastrophes from the sociological viewpoint, not from the political science, where there is a sociology of catastrophe saying that inequality bears on the result. Basically, that those that are poorer they suffer most the consequences on all levels, physical and mentally. And those that have more means, but they can pay psychoanalysts or they can go, elsewhere to heal the trauma. And the last point has to do with Spain. And Adelina, I was in Spain when the Valencia terrible mess happened, and then how today natural catastrophes are adding to an increasingly polarized, virulent, hateful debate that we see again now in the conclave in the Vatican. So if you could comment from these different angles on these points, more than questions, they are just provocative points.
Steffi or Kalle, who should start? Should I start?
Yeah, I think the last question was to you.
Yeah, I mean, I fully, first, in fact, I wanted to do a comment to Kalle's presentation. I can fully imagine that, for example, the Valencia disaster, it's still remembered in 20, 30 years and still blamed to the political party of that time, okay? And as Rhian was mentioning, the management of this disaster is using as a political weapon, let's say. Okay, it's being politicalized.
Weaponized.
Yeah, weaponized. But I want to say that this whole procedure was used in the political environment to blame the parties, no? And this is your fault, this is your fault, and used to destroy the political parties. So I fully agree with you on that. The reality is that the management was a disaster, independently of the political party in power back then. And something similar, but in a much smaller order of magnitude, happened in Catalonia a few weeks later, and the same flooding emergency, and it was the population was prepared. We knew what to do. The alert was declared in advance. The information was provided. So it's a reality that the management was terrible. It's also a reality that this bad behavior in the management is used as a political weapon. Yes, so they are fighting to each other. And another comment you did about the corruption is also true. Some of the money in fact, this happened in Valencia too, which is another disaster, is that some of the money collected to reconstruct the houses was taken by some people and they just stole it. So they said they were going to construct the houses and help constructing the houses, and they just took the money of the donations and, of the private investors, and they just ran away. So sadly, when these natural disasters occur, it lets the best of human being appear, but also the worst, I think. So, and this is sadly the situation in La Palma and in the tsunami and in the flooding. Yeah, I don't know if I replied to your question.
Gracias, Adelina.
De nada. If there are, I wanted to do a comment to Rhian, if it's possible.
Thank you, Asriel. Yes. Yeah, sure. Now you're free to comment on each other.
Yeah, I was very interested about the parallelism between the Icelandic example and La Palma example. And one of the things you said, for the most of the people we talked to, the worst thing was to lose the photo albums, the memories, and everything that is not tangible, that you cannot buy in a shop or something like that. So this is what they regret most, to the politicians and to the whole emergency management. One of the things, of course. And also the loss of the community sense. So many people, they miss their neighborhood, they miss their normal way of life. Not the landscape, as you said, it was so similar what you were saying in La Palma. And also the fact that some people left the island, are planning to never come back. So because they are highly traumatized. And so regarding of the memories, there is an initiative in Spain, at least they want to ask for the project, to help the people in this, to the communities at risk, to digitalize the memories. So to put everything in digital format, so if this happens again, all the picture of the memories or everything that you cannot recover, it's in a digital cloud or something like that. So at least you don't lose that. And this has been proven, at least in La Palma, to be one of the worst things that has happened, that they lost all the memories. And I found it very interesting because in this sense, the cultural difference makes no difference at all. So at the end, we are all humans, and this is the most important part, no? Our memories and our community, no? And I find it really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it, Sophie.
Yes. Yeah, I actually wanted to close, but Jeffrey asked a really good question here in the chat that I also wanted to ask in some format. So I let him speak again.
Okay, thanks, Steffi. Yeah, this was one thing that I was thinking of, especially during Adelina's presentation, there was a lot of focus on being specifically prepared for a volcano, and we could apply this to many other hazards. But I was thinking, in the aftermath of this, and in the case on Iceland, there was definitely a lot of trauma that persisted for years, for even decades. And are there more general approaches that, if we had better efforts on just promoting resilience in general, do you think that could have an effect regardless of the crisis?
I don't know, Ryan, you want to answer? I think that a better preparedness improves highly resilience, and the community won't be less traumatized. And you need to talk to people. For example, I have several friends in Chile. They experience a lot of earthquakes, like in a yearly basis, and of course those that they suffer a lot of loss, they are traumatized, but they are not as traumatized that they need to leave the country. So because they are highly prepared for that, they have their emergency kits, they have a background knowledge how to react, they know how to react, and they know they live exposed to this risk, and they made peace with that. So they found an equilibrium between living under risk and living there in their community. So they are not surprised when something bad happens. Of course, we are talking about normal bad, no earthquake 9 magnitude bad. But I am convinced that improving the preparedness helps reducing this PTS that we are experiencing now. I don't know what Ryan thinks about it, but
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, so I don't want to give you the actual answer because I don't know. But at least in the Icelandic context, in the run up and after things like the 2010 eruption, obviously the government and the systems within the government have evacuation plans and things like that for most places. But in the last kind of 10, 15 years, they've started actually engaging with local communities. And, it was about 10 years ago, they did a trial run. So they set aside one day for this specific part of Iceland and said, on Friday, we're going to pretend there's an eruption and we're going to do an event and see what would happen. And they did a complete dry run of a full evacuation of this whole quadrant of Iceland. And they worked out what worked well and what didn't work well, and which farms didn't have signal to get the messages through and things like that. And one of the key themes that came back from that was that you can't tell us what to do because, we know this land better than you. We've lived on this land for centuries, for generations. And so a lot of the things that were naturally put into place by people in power, they weren't farmers, or they didn't have that knowledge of the local landscape. And they were saying, well, if you live here, you should evacuate here to the evacuation centre. And the local people are saying, well, but if I drive that way, that's where like the glacial floodwaters come. Like it makes far more sense to me to go this way. It's a shorter distance away from the danger, but you're telling me to drive across potential floodplains to get to an evacuation centre. So in that sense, like all of the localized plans now are being kind of co-developed with local people. And it might be that nothing changes, that it was a great plan and everyone agrees, but it might be that there's pockets where this is great as an evacuation center for these people, but you need a secondary one over here, or you need to think about different communication styles. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to your question, to be completely honest, Jeffrey, but I think similar to Adelina, like if you engage with people in advance, so they understand what the risks are, understand what to expect, and understand how to keep themselves safe or to secure help from someone else, I think that by default adds to resilience, because it's the unknown, it's the uncertainty, it's the losing control that I feel would impact on my resilience. And so having those things set up could or should help. But I'm not a psychologist, so I don't promise.
Very valuable reflections. Thank you.
Yeah, Kalle, do you want to add something to this?
Yeah, I can add something, because I think this was a great question as well. Because I think in terms of the specific, I think when it comes to having kits at home to if you're gonna survive a volcano, you might need some sort of thermal blanket or something. I think that's important. But I think when it comes to, if we want really resilient societies, I think the focus on community is really important. That's something that's found in droves in the literature, right? And I think we really want communities where people know each other. We want an abundance of weak ties, because while we can have these blankets at home and kits to survive, we can have government plans, we need people in order to survive. So I think to have communities and really foster communities where people know each other and know that they can rely on each other is the key to true community resilience, right? And that's really hard to get right. So that's sort of the million-dollar question, in my opinion. How can we foster societies that are truly resilient? Because that requires a community effort, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a really good word of closure. I think we could go on for